Bank fraud's a huge problem in Canada. Over the years, people have lost hundreds of millions of dollars. The Liberal government's bringing in new measures to help protect fraud victims, but advocates are not impressed.
It's amazing that you don't see a finance minister wanting to protect 28 million bank customers.
The biggest problem, say critics, the new rules still don't make banks liable when customers lose money through transactions they didn't authorize, even when it's clear the bank should have spotted the fraud and blocked the transaction. Right now, we see a lot of blame the victim. And it's not just consumer advocates who've been calling for the banks to be more responsible for fraud. Canada's Ombudsman for Banking has too. That's the organization people go to try to resolve disputes with their banks. It says financial institutions have limited obligations to protect their customers from these crimes, and there needs to be a clear financial incentive for the banks to invest in strong fraud protection. In other words, if the banks were actually held responsible for a lot of the fraud that's happening, they might do more to prevent it in the first place. The Ombudsman also urged the government to cap how much money customers can lose from fraudulent transactions on their accounts. For things like e-transfer fraud. You know, the way you're only liable for $50 if you have credit card fraud and didn't do anything grossly negligent. But again, limited liability is not something the government decided to do. When we asked why, a spokesperson for the Department of Finance wouldn't say, but did say the government will consider further steps. And that makes Canada an outlier compared to places like Australia and the EU, where the banks are held liable. So what is the government doing? For one, it's forcing banks to come up with policies to detect and prevent fraud. It'll also be mandatory to train employees to spot fraud. And customers will now be able to set limits on certain types of transfers and disable features they don't use. Also, for the first time, banks will have to collect data on financial fraud and report it to the FCAC, so we'll get a better picture of how much fraud is actually happening. Right now, the CAFC tracks fraud, but it relies on what people report, and they think that's only about 5% of all cases. Banks that don't follow the rules could face fines, but historically, the regulator rarely uses that power, and when it does, the penalties are small. So where does all this leave consumers? Filing complaints with the Ombudsman, an agency whose decisions aren't binding and that only recommends the banks pay people back about 10% of the time. Have you dealt with fraud? Let us know in the comments or send us your story at gopublic@cbc.ca.